morning, good afternoon to you all. I want to begin our Women Get On Board speaker series virtual event today by acknowledging the land in which I live is in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. The Upper Canada Treaties cover this territory with the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon, the Waupun Agreement, and is directly adjacent to the Haldimand Treaty territory. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to enjoy the natural surroundings of this territory. I encourage all of you to become actively involved in understanding why land acknowledgements are important, in understanding Indigenous histories and contemporary Indigenous issues in Canada. I'm Deborah Rosati, founder and CEO of Women Get On Board. We are a member-based company that connects, promotes, and empowers women to corporate boards. We are over 800 members across Canada. We're diverse in our membership, and our goal is to get more women on boards. Women Get On Board is delighted to be hosting our first fall speaker series event, and yes, it is fall now, with our sponsor, UBS Investment Bank. Our topic today is going to be focused on the E of the ESG, and it is the first of our three-part series on ESG. And we're delighted that UBS Investment Bank is our sponsor for all three of those speaker series. So without further ado, we are really fortunate to have two great speakers today, and I'm very fortunate to introduce Aneliya Crawford. Aneliya Crawford is a managing director in the UBS Investment Bank and leads UBS's ESG advisory group efforts for the Americas. Aneliya was formerly UBS's global head of activism and defense. Aneliya has over 15 years of experience in corporate governance, shareholder activism, and M&A. She's advised on hundreds of major activism contests and contests for control, including campaigns in the US, Europe, Japan, Canada, Australia, and Latin America. As you can see from the rest of Aneliya's bio, which I will not read any further because we've posted it and you're so well accomplished and do a lot of work in advisory capacity on governance with the NAD in the New York chapter, the board and advisors of the Institute of Corporate Governance and Finance at NYU School of Law, frequent speaker and published author on topics of contests for corporate control, corporate governance, and hostile M&A. So Aneliya, we're delighted to have you and our other guest speaker, Sarah Keys. Over to you, Aneliya. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. This was, first of all, a very lengthy and flattering introduction. I really appreciate it. And I'd like to start by saying that on behalf of myself personally and UBS in general, I'm really very, very pleased and frankly proud to be a sponsor of this series of events with Women Get On Board. The mission of getting women on board is very important. And what Sarah and I will do today is hopefully help more women get on board by helping those who already are and those who are thinking about it be equipped with some really actionable, useful information that can make us all more effective in what we do on a daily basis. So with that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Sarah Keys. As you can see from the bio that's exhibited on your screen, she is an terrific expert and really the perfect person to address issues related to the environmental considerations in ESG. Sarah is the CEO of ESG Global Advisors. She has more than a decade of experience, particularly with issues related to climate change. And she serves as a consultant to boards and investors with respect to climate change and ESG issues. She is a thought leader in the space. She is a facilitator, a former auditor. She is a person who's looked at these issues from many different perspectives, and really in an ideal position to help the audience here, composed largely of public companies directors, think about what their role should be in this ongoing dialogue. Welcome, Sarah, and thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
So I'll start laying, if you will, the setting here. First of all, from a logistical point of view, we have reserved some time at the end for questions, but Sarah and I are fully cognizant of the fact that we are speaking to a very well-informed, very engaged group. So please do feel free to let us know if you have questions as we go along. We are both perfectly comfortable with having it more of a dynamic and interactive conversations with all of you. We want to make sure that the content today is tailored to what you're interested in learning more about, and we can be of maximum help here to you. Secondly, our goal is to be very pragmatic. In the next 1 hour, we want to really equip you, if you will, with thoughts, ideas, information that you can use in your day-to-day interactions as soon as you're off this call. So please help us tailor that to whatever is interesting to you as well. But we'll stay focused on being very, very pragmatic and very useful, hopefully, in terms of what we will discuss. For me, the interest in the environmental issues of the day is in some part driven by this very rapid evolution that we're seeing. And Sarah, I'll start by asking you your thoughts on this and the role of directors. From my vantage point, it really seems that there is a very rapid, if you will, development in that we started with the realization, all of us, that there are environmental issues that corporations must play an important role in targeting. We moved to asking companies for disclosure. From there, we are now seeing a lot of expectations for companies to set targets, particularly around greenhouse gas emissions and other climate-related, if you will, targets. And we're moving into the new, if you will, phase where corporates have, in large part, many of them set targets. Others are in the process of doing so, and we must tackle how do corporates deliver on the promises that they have made. And the first piece of this, I think, is for corporations to put their house in order in some ways, to decide structurally and internally who takes charge of these issues, who should be responsible, how should the organization play around the key responsible people for this, and what's the role of the board. As an advisor to boards frequently and to corporates, what are you seeing? And do you have any tips for our audience today on the best practice approach to this internal organization issue?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for such an interesting and thoughtful framing of our initial question here to kick us off. So it really is a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Women Get On Board and UBS Investment Bank for having me. I think this is such an important dialogue, and quite frankly, I feel very passionate about the leadership that we've seen from women, whether at the boardroom table or within industry, on the topic of ESG and sustainable finance. It's really quite an incredible platform for elevating women into these leadership conversations, and so I'm really delighted to be participating in part one of a three-part series, because I think this is so timely for all of you as Women Get On Board members and those who might be interested to learn a little bit more as to how ESG can be a differentiator for you at the boardroom table, both within your current boards and those you'll serve on in the future. Now, I've spent, as you heard in my introduction, I've spent over a decade working with boards of directors on this topic. And I just want to zoom out and say, if we really look at it, it's moved so quickly from the why should I care into the what do I need to do? And now, as you just outlined, Aneliya, how do I do it? And so I think what we're trying to get to is the practical level. Before I jump into kind of how we get organized, et cetera, I just wanted to give a bit of a perspective as to why this topic has become so hot. And I think it's the urgency. I really want to underscore that in order to achieve the aspirations of the Paris Agreement, to tackle the E in ESG, the biggest issue being climate change, which we will talk about at length today, we've really only got about 7 years left to cut greenhouse gas emissions globally in half. So the goal is to cut them in half by 2030 and peak them by 2025. So what used to be something that in boardroom conversations was a much more long-term 2050 conversation, we've certainly certainly seen that as organizations have been setting goals of net zero by 2050 aligned to the Paris Agreement on climate change, now they're facing the pressure to disclose and explain how they'll get there. What are those interim targets that boards are setting and overseeing for 2025 and 2030? And that's really squarely where we're trying to get into some practical tips for you today. And the number one question I get asked is, okay, we recognize that climate change aligns with our roles and responsibilities as corporate directors. And now we're trying to understand, how do we organize ourselves to effectively oversee this? Well, the bad news is there's no one size fits all. I don't have a silver bullet answer for you in terms of how to organize yourselves. Now, the good news is most organizations are actually leveraging their existing corporate governance policies, processes, and structures to effectively integrate oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities. What I really want to emphasize here is that best practice is for the full board to have oversight of climate change and environmental issues. Now, that means that they can leverage their existing committees to assist them in fulfilling those duties. What we often see, for example, is increasingly audit committees being asked to adapt and adjust their mandates and charters to explicitly require oversight of external reporting on climate change. And this has come in response to some of the new regulations requiring public companies to disclose climate change impacts and their greenhouse gas emissions. We've also started to see corporate governance and nominating committees having ESG and climate change explicitly included in their mandates and charters. And this is really around ensuring the board has the right skills and expertise to effectively oversee this issue. And last but certainly not least, we've seen a lot of compensation committees as sectors that are a little bit more advanced in their ESG strategies and approaches who have these targets actually seek to tie achieving those targets to their executive compensation plans. And so what we can see is we're not actually always looking to create a new committee on the board, a new special ESG committee, although in some cases we've also seen that. And so I wanted to offer a practical tip for all of you who may be serving on boards, trying to figure out how to organize yourselves. Leverage what you've already got in terms of that existing foundation, and think about how climate change and environmental issues intersect with not only the board's responsibility for oversight of strategy and risk, but ultimately the mandates of those committees who support the board in fulfilling those duties. For those of you who work in higher emitting sectors and who support organizations that maybe have been on the front lines of this, and I'm talking about oil and gas, utilities, and mining companies, they often do have specialized ESG committees simply because this is such a large issue that if they don't have a dedicated committee, there's a concern that it might get lost in the mix. So there is no one size fits all. It really matters based on what sector you're in, what jurisdictions you're operating in, and your entity-specific circumstances.
Sarah, this is so illuminating. I wonder, how do we make sure that we don't create silos within the organizations where there's different pockets in charge of different pieces and there's not enough cohesion? And it's interestingly enough, Climate Week was taking place in New York last week, and it was very interesting to hear some of the public sector people speaking of it and tackling why have governments and organizations not been more effective, if you will, in tackling these issues? And some of them suggested that it's because you have the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of this and that, and there's not necessarily a very comprehensive look at how ESG impacts all these. You end up with people each pushing for their own function. Is there a concern around this in terms of committee organizations on boards?
I think it's such an important question, and it reflects the complexity of the challenge. I always say when working with boards, this is completely uncharted territory. We've never tackled not only an existential threat to the future of life on this planet, but we've never tackled something that is so widespread and systemic. So some research out of the United States found that 90% of public equities could be materially impacted by climate change. So it's definitely a myth or a misconception that only high emitting sectors have to pay attention. And so what we start to see is not only do we need to target, the high emitting sectors and those who provide fossil fuels and energy, But we're talking about consumers of energy across every single sector as well. So the issue of climate change is so complex that I think the public sector and private sector alike are trying to figure out whose duties are what. Now, when we think about how organizations are tackling this, a couple of really practical examples. I've seen a really strong use case for ESG steering committees at the management level. A lot of boards of directors are getting comfortable with the idea that in order to effectively address climate change across the organization, it's going to require a multidisciplinary team. So what we often see is, while it's best practice for the board to have full oversight of climate change, it's also best practice for the CEO to have full accountability. But to actually fulfill those duties, what we're starting to see as a best practice is those cross-functional ESG steering committees that represent human resources. From a talent attraction and retention standpoint, we're hearing more and more that for the war for talent, especially with younger generations, organizations are going to have to be able to tell that climate change story and how they're thinking about it in their business. We need to involve finance and legal to help us understand what are the data we need to be collecting. How do we ensure it's timely, accurate, credible, and can be disclosed in our external filings? And then there's operations, right, where so much of the rubber hits the road for most organizations. So a lot of best practice that we're seeing to avoid those silos is clear accountabilities for different functions, but also having that group conversation as a steering committee, which ultimately reports up to the CEO and provides updates to the board. When we think about the actual committee structures, it really can be a double-edged sword. There is no one right answer, and I think it does come down to the culture and type of corporate governance structure that the organization has. So the same mechanisms that would be used to feed up information from the audit committee or the corporate governance and nominating committee should be applied for climate change information as well. But there definitely is the argument that for those who are really on the front lines of this, who've faced a lot of institutional and stakeholder pressure on what they're doing on climate change, and I'm thinking of the high emitting sectors now, they do have these standalone ESG committees to simply not lose sight of it. So again, really bringing it down to what's the issue, how widespread is it for our organization, and what's the most effective way to organize ourselves to avoid those silos, which are a very real risk.
Yeah, that's so fascinating, Sarah, and I'm so glad that you're bringing up the ESG steering committee idea, because it is an issue of the silos. But here's another thing that's kind of popping up in my mind as I'm hearing you describe this construct. A lot of the reactions and questions that I have seen, for example, in my interactions with clients, relate to how do they connect the dots between the ESG professionals that have been hired internally within management teams and then the business functions, if you will. There are many companies, if you will, who in response to the pressure from markets and just the general understanding of their responsibilities, have hired sustainability officers, chief sustainability officers. Some of them have entire ESG departments. And what I find, and this is the question that I also have for you, whether you're seeing something similar and how can we explain it, but in many organizations, these ESG departments and chief sustainability officers are primarily responsible for reporting on the ESG efforts of the company. They're almost an IR/PR type of a function. They build the sustainability reports. They're the ones who are putting out information of what's going on. And the business functions, the CEO, the CFO, the various operational heads and other function heads within the organizations are just tangentially interacting with this function. So obviously it's a problem. And I think the ESG steering committee that you're describing is a good way to tackle this. But is this a reflection in some part of companies understanding that what they need to do at this point is integrate ESG into their business, into their strategy? Are we now actually seeing managements and boards waking up to the idea that putting out a sustainability report, very lengthy and even very high quality in some instances, is simply not enough? And we now just have to make every single business decision at the highest level of the organization with climate change, with ESG, and particularly with the E in mind every step of the way. Is that being internalized?
Such a good question. And look, I'm going to start by saying, over the past several years, you're bang on. We've seen the S&P 500 accelerate their sustainability and ESG reports, now to the point that 90% of the S&P 500 issue some form of a voluntary sustainability or ESG report. That was not the case just a couple of years ago. And, I always say, and especially for board members, don't let the reporting tail wag the dog. And the analogy I often use is, say I was, as an accountant, say I was a small business and I went to my accountant and I said, I need financial statements. No, you don't need financial statements. You need a business strategy and sales in order to produce financial statements that reflect your financial performance. The same goes for ESG reporting. I get a lot of corporate clients coming and saying, I need to produce an ESG report. My investors or my stakeholders are asking for it. Well, in fact, the ESG report is simply an output of a well thought out ESG strategy. And increasingly, we are seeing those being set right at the top of the house. Boards of directors and management teams actually working together to identify what are the most financially material, environmental, social, and governance issues that could impact our ability to execute on our corporate strategy and create long-term value for our shareholders and other stakeholders. And now that that light has gone on, I really don't think there's any turning back. So what we started to see, to your point, is where maybe they had historical sustainability groups, they've really been elevated right up into that C-suite conversation. And so sometimes we're actually helping to advise them into how to translate some of that traditional language that's come from the corporate social responsibility domain, where it's more about philanthropy and positive reputation with stakeholders. How do we identify what the subset of CSR issues are that are actually financially material to executing on business strategy? And how do we communicate that up to the C-suite? So we've seen two things happening. We've seen the leadership coming from the top of the house and the elevation of some of these historical roles in sustainability being brought up, not just from reporting anymore, but actually saying, we need to be thinking thoughtfully about this strategy, and our report, that'll reflect all of the good work that we've done internally. And I think that's a really important takeaway for those of you who may be serving on boards that are just getting started with this. The natural inclination is to get to the report. But I always say to my clients, the best content in those reports is one that's been really well thought out and has an integrated strategy that's pulled on those key facets of the business, so we know we can actually get it done. And I'm sure you're going to ask, and I'm sure we'll hear about it from the audience, but this is also going to help you tackle greenwashing. Having a genuine strategy that is clearly connected to the business's mission, vision, values, and corporate priorities helps readers to understand how the organization is thinking about these issues in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I want to hone in a little bit on the business strategy points that you're making, which I think are so important in terms of just helping our director audience think about the right things they should be asking management. I wonder what your thoughts are on this focus. There's definitely a lot of focus from advisors and management teams on trying to understand the risks, the risk components of climate change and of environmental issues. The physical risks, which of course involves supply chain disruptions, natural disasters, catastrophic events that are now happening across the globe and affecting many businesses. The transition risks, which of course captures all the various financial and other risks that companies might be undergoing as they're changing their business models to, let's say, more energy renewable rather than old school oil and gas type of business, to give the most extreme example. But I find, and I wonder whether you're finding the same, and how can directors tackle it if that's the case, I find that not enough emphasis is being put on the growth opportunities, if you will, the upside from looking to focus on energy transition, looking to focus on these new areas, on electrifying, on energy efficiency in the operations of companies. There's a lot that companies can do to just position themselves in a better place vis-a-vis their competitors. And that seems to be lost sometimes, if you will, for CEOs in particular, who tend to leave to CFOs and COOs the risks, and they themselves are always thinking about the opportunities. And I find that this is the area where we really want to engage with top of the house and where directors can play a part. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it is a critical piece of the conversation that you're right gets lost. We talk a lot about the financial stability risks posed by climate change, and that's been a big push for the disclosure. Really understanding from the investor standpoint, they're really trying to understand what are the risks we're taking on when we invest in this company, and how do we ensure that we're getting paid for them in terms of those risk-adjusted returns. But the flip side of risk is opportunity. Those risks immediately create new market opportunities. And the framework you just identified, from a physical to transition risks, both of those can be flipped on their head to think about how organizations can position themselves to not only be competitive relative to peers, but for Canada as a country to be competitive relative to other jurisdictions, particularly given we have such a natural resource-based economy. We face some unique challenges as a result, and I personally believe we have a huge opportunity in front of us to show the world what responsible resource development can look like, because resources are going to be required to address climate change in all scenarios. Even when we limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we're going to need oil and gas. We're going to need minerals. We need minerals for the batteries that we want to electrify everything with. And when I talk to directors about this topic, I think the most impactful way to do this is to link up a climate lens with your strategic planning process. So as you're going through that exercise of saying, okay, we're sitting down with management, we're having retreats, we're talking about the future strategy and business model of the organization, we need to apply a climate lens that not only thinks about the risks to achieving our strategy, but how might we be able to position ourselves as a low carbon future solution for clients, customers, and even to attract employees relative to some of our peers. The thing that I think is really interesting in this regard is the massive opportunities that are presented by the fact that, net zero by 2050, it is no small task. I outlined at the very beginning, halving emissions by 2030. Peaking them by 2025 globally. And Canada only represents less than 2% of global emissions. So even if we turned off our economy tomorrow, we would still have this climate change challenge. But the direction of travel is clear. We are moving as a world toward net zero. And so directors that are thinking about the long-term implications, not only for their business model, but the markets where they want to play, I think that's the opportunity set that is missing in the conversation. And when we think about that strategic planning, many organizations, and I'm sure many of you in the audience who are serving on boards who have set net zero targets or are thinking about a greenhouse gas emissions reduction target, the hardest part now is how do we get there? And I think as we try to get into the how, we can recognize there's a lot of opportunity to access new pools of capital to help us finance this. We've seen some great examples of all the large North American banks setting out some of their sustainable finance commitments, where they're actually creating new pools of capital at favorable interest rates to help companies, particularly small, medium enterprises, invest in projects to reduce their emissions while generating a financial return. And so we can start to see that as the world is moving in this direction, companies that are proactive are going to have a leg up from those who are kind of dragged along, kicking and screaming, trying to just comply with all of the new laws and regulations. And I think that's one of the things that excites boards the most is, okay, we recognize this is important. Now, how do we compete? How do we play? How do we win?
Yeah. It's such an important point, and it helps me transition us to what I think we should talk about a little bit more next, which is how do boards interact with their stakeholders and their expectations. And on to your point of how to, let me offer up a quick story for the benefit of our audience. A couple of weeks ago, maybe it was more like a month at this point, I sat down and talked to the founder of Engine No. 1, who, as some of you may know, is an investor that shook up Exxon and not too long ago and put 3 directors on their board. But they're an investor who's very focused on environmental issues at the companies. And so as I was speaking to him, he gave me the following example. He was explaining how they decide on their investments in car manufacturers. And he said, every single car manufacturer out there has set some targets of converting to an electric fleet by whatever year. There is simply not enough lithium in the world today for this to be possible for each and every one of them. They simply will not have enough batteries that can be manufactured for this to be possible. So when I engage with car manufacturers, he told me, I want to understand what have they already done to deliver on these plants, because this is how I know who's going to actually be able to deliver, and I'll invest with them, and who's going to fail at this. So this is what's defining now the winners and losers in the market. Sarah, to your point, who has already proactively started building the strategies to make whole on the commitments that they have made. And the one thing that's very interesting to me in that conversation, you brought up the point of urgency earlier on. Are corporate boards or just corporates generally and their boards and investors on the other hand on the same page in terms of the urgency and what needs to be done today? Is there a disconnect?
I think there is, and I think we're closing that gap relatively quickly. But I do believe that the institutional investors, they have been leading this charge. And really, as I mentioned earlier, simply because they're concerned about their risk-adjusted returns of their long-term portfolios. When we look in North America in particular, which I think, of course, is of relevance to this audience, I'm so glad that you brought up the ExxonMobil example, because I wanted to pull on that thread as well. When we think about, and I have the privilege of working with kind of both sides of the equation, the path for most institutional investors in North America is first to engage, and then at a very last resort to consider putting a shareholder proposal on the ballot and ultimately issuing a vote against, and very, very last resort being divestment. So what we see North American institutional investors doing is an engagement first approach. This has started to really rise up to the level of the board, where we see institutional investors seeking to meet with corporate directors to understand how they're getting comfortable with management's plans for the low carbon transition. And the ExxonMobil case is a very interesting example of what happens when boards of directors do not have an ear to the ground with their stakeholders and are not asking the right questions of management with respect to what they're hearing from their current shareholders. And so, as you alluded to, I just want to give a quick reminder. So a couple of years before this happened to ExxonMobil, they put a climate scientist on the board. And this is the real reminder to all of you. Every one of us needs to become climate literate such that we can ask good questions of management to ensure we're fulfilling our duties. So it's not a one and done, the same way as it's not a one and done with putting one woman on your board and now we've got gender diversity. And so you can see that that did not work for ExxonMobil. And in fact, as a result, the board was not, it seems they might have been resting on their laurels a little bit. They did not ask the questions of management with respect to what are our investors saying about the net zero transition and our readiness, and ultimately found themselves ousting 3 directors because they got majority support from the large institutional investors such as the BlackRocks of the world. What's the key takeaway for folks from this? I think what's really important is hindsight is no longer how we're moving forward. So you would never drive your car down the freeway looking only in the rearview mirror. And I would highly encourage everyone to be looking forward in terms of what is the pace and scale of those trends that are coming at us. But the second piece here is really all around ensuring that boards are asking the right questions on the urgency of this. So we see a lot of management teams, yes, we're paying attention to climate change. Here's a few practical things you can ask as a board in the strategic planning process. Have we considered additional expenditures in things like innovation and R&D to diversify our business model if we're heavily reliant on fossil fuels? Are we putting capital expenditures into our traditional business model or new ones? Have we met with our stakeholders to evaluate how they really consider the company's performance in this area and any suggestions they might have in terms of concerns? Because institutional investors have been studying companies for a number of years. Now that everyone has made these commitments, the questions are going to get harder. And so one good resource I'd love to point our audience to on this net zero conversation comes from Climate Action 100+. So that's a collaboration of investors who are engaging with the 100 largest emitters in the world. Just a heads up, Climate Engagement Canada has now been established here in this country, and they've just published a list of focus companies they will be engaging with. And what they have is a 10-point net zero company benchmark. It's a good thing for board members to take a look at and start asking questions of management. It touches on things like, are we putting appropriate capital expenditures in place to meet our targets? Have we set more short-term and interim targets? Are we linking executive compensation? And what's our plan for a just transition that considers impacts on Indigenous communities and Indigenous reconciliation, for example? So that's a nice cheat sheet I often point directors to.
That is so useful. Thank you very much, Sarah. That's a great it's a great reference point, and it leads me to my question about what is the board duty, if you will, in all this, or even the individual director's duty. How much detailed oversight are we expecting from boards? And I ask this because, to your point about the difference in the urgency between investors on the one hand and managements on the other hand, frequently I personally experience interactions with CEOs who feel that a lot of these issues, particularly as they relate to employees, let's say, as another stakeholder, or their suppliers as another stakeholder, they feel that some of the expectations on the E front, if you will, are just good business, and they don't need to necessarily proactively do anything about it. Mm-hmm. They are, of course, going to make sure that their workforce is diverse and engaged. They are, of course, going to do X, Y, and Z, but not necessarily more than this. And yet, while management is doing something that they feel is just good business, you end up in situations like the Exxon case, where there's clearly a shareholder rebellion erupting all of a sudden, giving a very clear indication that no, in fact, the company was not moving fast enough, or maybe it was not even going in the right direction. So what's the fiduciary duty that boards have in the midst of this to try to de-escalate a situation where shareholders have to step up the pressure to the level of running an Exxon-like contest, and ensure that a CEO who's comfortably saying, yes, 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 I get it, this is just good business, of course we're doing it, is actually taking the steps, as you're outlining, that are necessary? Is it enough to ask the questions like the ones that you just listed? What else do they need to do?
Yeah, I think, again, it's such a dynamic and fast-paced space. And for years I heard, climate doesn't belong on the boardroom table. It is not aligned with our fiduciary duty, and that's the end of that conversation. Things have certainly changed, and I want to point out three things. And just, I see the chat questions about, resources, that kind of thing. I will make sure to work with Deborah and the team at Women Get On Board. We will get all of those links out to you if you can't jot down notes quickly enough. Three areas I want to point you to. The first was a very important codification of the BCE decision through the CBCA. So the Canadian Business Corporations Act was amended a couple of years ago, not to require, but to permit boards of directors to consider stakeholders beyond just shareholders. This is an incredibly important adjustment, given so many organizations are incorporated under the CBCA. What it has now said is you are permitted to consider shareholders as well as other stakeholders, and they explicitly include the environment as one of them. So this now has changed the landscape. Two additional documents that I would love to point folks to. A very strong legal opinion written by Carol Hansel, a prominent lawyer here in Canada, which explicitly links climate-related risks and opportunities with fiduciary duty and directors' responsibilities, duty of care to the corporation. And this opinion was first published a couple of years ago, just updated over the summer of this year. And we'll make sure to get a link on that because it really does clearly articulate the legal perspective in terms of what boards of directors need to do to satisfy themselves that they're effectively overseeing this issue. And then on a more practical level, we also saw a third piece of guidance coming out from the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative. They're an organization globally. They have work all over the world, and they have a Canada-specific document that talks about directors' obligations and duties to oversee climate change. And so these types of resources are clearly clarifying that this belongs squarely in the boardroom and at that table. Now, just coming back to what can directors do to avoid an Exxon situation, I'm consistently finding that because the environmental and climate change space is moving so quickly, there are new regulations every day. Institutional investors are continuing to up the bar in terms of expectations on pace and scale of investment to transition to net zero. We're quickly seeing that there is going to be change all the time, and therefore boards need to keep refreshing themselves. So I'm finding a lot of boards of directors are doing bespoke education sessions on what is the E and ESG, how does it impact our organization, and what do we need to be staying on top of? And so a lot of boards doing this at board retreats, part of strategic planning conversations, and even part of regular board meetings on a quarterly basis.
I am just going to comment on the bespoke piece of this. I think that all of this is such incredibly valuable information, but I think it's very, very important for boards to recognize that every company needs to assess its situation specifically. This is where the focus on materiality comes from. We find, and I'm sure that Sarah has the same experience, that every company is very different in terms of the key aspects on environmental risks and opportunities that affect its specific business. So any educational session, I think, to be truly useful to directors has to also take into consideration the business of this particular company and its challenges and its opportunities to assess what's really material to the survival of the company. I have tons more questions for Sarah, but I really want to make sure that our audience has an adequate chance to direct the conversation towards the topics important for them. With that, I will actually let Deborah jump in here and focus us on any questions that the audience has asked in the chat, which unfortunately I cannot see, or happy to jump in with additional questions. Deborah, passing it on to you.
Oh, wow. What a learning. You two in half an hour have intrigued, have inspired, and somewhat, I don't know, had a scare tactic too, because if we don't do it, we should have done something earlier. And I really like the fact that you've geared it to, as a director, what should you be thinking, not and really the practical side of the tips. And so Sarah, you were very kindly reading some of the comments there. And so what we'll do, Sarah, if you can share those particular, I think the last references that you had. We have an email that's going out shortly right after, but it'll go in the following email. So hang tight, everyone. We'll get those links. They're very, very valuable. And I too have read the Carol Hansel's legal opinion on climate change and what boards should be thinking about. Phenomenal document. So, and I think, you know, at the end of the day, I think that there is a couple questions, and I am likewise having trouble finding those questions. Let me see 1 second. I have one right now. So before you even begin, such valuable information, not a question, but a comment. So thank you. The first question that came up was, and maybe I'll direct this to you, Sarah, and Aneliya, feel free to weigh in as well. Can you please elaborate on the comment that North America banks are setting out pools of capital for transition? Maybe actually that's you, Aneliya, first, and then Sarah, please. I mean, you come from the banking world yourself, Aneliya. Can you comment on that?
Yes, very happy to do so. It's really, really important for all of us to understand. I think that the environmental issues we face today, bizarrely, are not suffering from inadequate financing. We have the financing, and we do have, in many instances, the technological solutions. So it is almost mystifying why we are not moving even faster in terms of getting things done. But banks do have pools of capital available for a lot of the projects that are related to climate change transition that companies are facing. We, for example, let me get a little more specific. We have an asset management division, a wealth management, and an investment bank. Our asset management invests a lot of money into ESG strategies. As a matter of fact, this is where our sustainability finance group is hosted. This is the fastest growing. We manage so much money that is earmarked for ESG strategies. It almost makes your head spin in terms of what's going on there. Similarly, on the wealth management side, we are dealing with a lot of clients who are specifically looking to invest their money in projects And our group is focused on creating these products. So if people care specifically about technologies related to carbon capture, this is specifically where your money will be put into. And that connection is constantly being made. I'm in the investment banking side. So our ESG advisory is our leading ESG effort in terms of advising public companies on how to transition. And we do that through our energy group in Houston. We really are working across all different sectors, and we do finance transitions. We help companies through our advice on how to do it, and we help them figure out the strategies in terms of living up to their commitments. So we are doing so much in so many different aspects. Banks are, I think, very much leading the effort in many respects here, financing transition plans. I don't know, Sarah, if you have an additional comment on this.
No, I would just underscore that in particular, it is a really lively conversation here in Canada around, I'm sure many of you have heard of the green bond side of things. Going out and getting proceeds for green initiatives. What has historically happened is, because we are a natural resource-based economy, some of our industries have been locked out of accessing that capital because they're not de facto green, even though we need them for this transition to the earlier point, lack of lithium to actually help all those auto manufacturers make those EVs that they've committed to. So what has started to happen is the emergence of transition bonds, which is going to allow higher emitting sectors to actually access pools of capital that didn't otherwise exist to decarbonize. And this is a really important part of the puzzle here, because when we really think about the climate crisis, we need every single sector to decarbonize, not just those that are already green.
Wow, such great insights. Question here. Would love to hear tips on dealing with fellow board members who are non-believers in climate change. So is that hit them into submission, or how do you get them to succumb to reality? Sarah, I mean, you work with a lot of boards, and I'm sure you see believers and non-believers. Anything you'd like to provide tips or advice to other board members?
You know what? It's such an important question, because this is a reality of what happens around the boardroom table. And as someone who goes in and observes these dynamics, it's always there. There are some who are clearly much more interested and engaged on this topic, and some who might be pushing back a little bit. First of all, I think that's healthy debate. I think that the conversation around the tables that I've seen have become far more sophisticated, less about whether climate change is real, more about how the organization actually tackles it, which is good news. For those who may be saying it doesn't belong on the boardroom table, I would really emphasize and underscore one thing. Let's meet them where they are. And what I mean by that is really understand what are their hesitations, concerns, or views with respect to the issue and why they feel that resistance. 9 times out of 10, there's actually a connection point for them to understand that climate change could impact the things that they care about as well. And I think meeting them where they are and exercising some empathy in those conversations goes an incredibly long way. And I've seen boardrooms go through that exercise and really bring people along in a way that instills trust. And at the end of the day, the board is going to need to oversee this. This is not a one-time conversation. So helping to educate, maybe sharing Carol Hansel's opinion, for example, can also be a useful way to share resources and educate those who might not fully appreciate why this is so important.
Thank you, Sarah.
I want to add something, Deborah, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think because this is really such an important question, so thank you very much to whoever asked it. I think that another aspect of the educational piece that Sarah is referring to, which I think is true, is bringing it down to the numbers. It is very hard for those who feel that ESG is fluff and something that's nice to have, but not necessarily a necessity for businesses. It seems to be very compelling when they see really the data that shows difference. We are not yet at a time where we can comfortably say the valuations of companies at the stock prices at which they trade reflect directly ESG efforts, but we are getting close to it. We are really getting very close to it. You can never identify a single indicator that will tell you why the stock price of a company is quite there. And you will never be able to specifically say that a company's cost of capital, that is their ability to borrow cheaply, has fallen dramatically because they have access to ESG funds. But you can look at examples and you can see how they fare. For example, we have one very impactful, I think, slide that's convinced so many non-believers. It compares to industrial companies, ABB and Schneider, that are effectively the same in terms of what they do. They're both good ESG performers because they're focused on electrification. They're exactly the same company. However, one of them has access to ESG investors, money that is specifically focused on ESG, and they've been very good at telling their equity story and how they have been focused on electrification, on really the EPs in a way that is genuinely moving things forward, and the other one has not. And you can see the difference in their valuations. And there are examples of this in basically every sector out there, because the reality is the investors are becoming more segmented. They have expectations in terms of what the environmental commitments of companies should be and what role they should play. And if you want to be able to tap into all this capital, make it cheaper for you to borrow, make your stock price higher, you just cannot afford to stay on the sidelines, even if you're not a believer in ESG. Be a believer as a director in making money. You can still see it on paper. And that seems to be convincing a lot of people, in my experience, who are currently not fully appreciating the value of this work.
Well, Aneliya, I know you can't see the chat questions, but that was exactly one of the questions. So
Okay.
Thank you for advancing that one. But I do want to come back to a question that's in the queue here. And maybe I'll start with you, Sarah. Can you elaborate on climate literate, what being climate literate is? Like, you know, we have a definition of financial literacy. So can you comment what it means to be climate literate and what assessments are available to determine that climate literacy?
Far more challenging than defining financial literacy and how one would assess it, but an important question. And we hear this, right? Climate competent boards, climate literate directors. What does this mean? So my personal view on this is a climate literate director understands what are the most material climate related risks and opportunities for their organization, and understands the processes, policies, and mechanisms in place to identify, assess, measure, and manage those. You don't need to be a climate expert. You don't need to be a climate scientist, but you certainly could call yourself climate literate if you understand the implications of this big macro problem on your organization specifically. It comes back to that materiality of point, which I think is so important. And you actually understand how the organization is mitigating risks and, importantly, capturing those new opportunities. I think really understanding the connection there is an essential piece of this puzzle. And with climate literacy, I would say it's never going to be one and done. I'm forever learning in these sessions. I'm always learning something new, from whether it's the questions or just the dialogue. And I think it's one that we're going to have to keep continuous education on.
Thank you, Sarah. Did you want to comment on that, Aneliya? And then we're going to wrap it up for the day.
I would just say that the good news here is that there are so many really highly qualified experts that one can tap into. As a board, I don't really think, such as Sarah, for example, I don't think that any director has a duty to be more than literate in the more common term, if you will, meaning of it, or conversational, as we like to call it, because now there are really there's a lot of expertise, there's a lot of knowledge out there in terms of people who are able to help boards understand the dynamics. In some ways, it's even too risky, I think, for boards to be relying on themselves alone trying to navigate this. I mean, we all know that ESG rating agencies seem to be all over the place with little correlation between the ratings that they're giving. It is very difficult for many to be able to balance the E, S, and G components of this, of the whole picture, if you will. So I would say that while of course there are some duties, and I think that Sarah's definition of literacy was terrific, and there is of course the need to understand the risks and the opportunities aspect, but there's also a lot of help. So I think the board should not hesitate to rely on experts in that.
Well, on that note, these two experts we've had in this very engaging conversation, I want to thank Aneliya and Aneliya, sorry, my apologies, Aneliya and Sarah for taking this time to really showcase their passions on this topic, but to provide really practical tips and insights. And I think it's a topic near and dear to all of us. And it is, again, continuing the conversations and where you need to lean in. We'll never all be experts, and it's evolving, as you said, Sarah. So thank you both. Wanted to thank on behalf of Women Get On Board. We will be donating to our charity partner, Dress for Success, the Toronto chapter, to thank you for your time and your insights. We want to thank UBS Investment Bank for being our sponsor to kick off our first of our ESG series today, and great conversations on the E of the ESG. And then our next speaker series, as in this slide, is on the G of the ESG, October 25th. And Aneliya, we're going to have a fireside chat with you and Mary Larson, who's a partner at MMP, who does a lot on the S it should say the S of the ESG.
Yeah, it should be the S, yeah.
Not the G, it is the S. We're going in order. So it will be on the S of the ESG. And same time, so hopefully in the follow-up email, we will be sending out a survey feedback. So really look forward to that. The next few days, we'll get out a recording, and Sarah will make sure we get the links for some of the references and materials that you've spoken about. And as everyone is signing off, I can hear excellent session, well prepared. And I just wanted to thank you both for making this time and really digging into some of the practical, because it is pretty scary when you think about the E of the ESG. And we have to take action now. If we want to get somewhere in 2030 or even 2050. So I just want to say thank you, Aneliya. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you to our Women Get On Board team for supporting this event. Happy fall season to all of you. We will see you hopefully October 25th. And Sarah, I hope this is the kickoff for your day. I think you said you've got 5 sessions today. So thank you for joining us. And thank you, Aneliya.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.